Hey guys, Mr. Backerberg here. In this video, we're going to look at trigonometric functions of any angle. Now, we're going to take what we know about the definitions of the 6 basic trig functions, and we're going to extend beyond just triangles. So we don't have to restrict down our attention to acute angles or even just to positive angles. Now, in geometry, we defined an angle as two rays with a common vertex that are pointing in different direction, and that creates an angle between those two rays. But now in trigonometry, we're going to think about it a little bit differently. What we're going to do is we're going to think about having one ray and then taking that ray and rotating it to a new location, and that's going to create our angles this time. That side that we're starting with, we're going to call the initial side, and wherever the ray stops, we're going to call that our terminal side. So then the measure of our angle would be some description as to how far we rotated from our initial side over to our terminal side. Now, as we're thinking about these angles, positive angles are going to rotate counterclockwise, but negative angles are going to rotate clockwise. Now, what we're going to do to make things easy on ourselves is we're going to plot these angles out on a coordinate grid. And what we want to deal with are angles in what's called standard position. And what that means is that we're going to line up our initial side along the positive x-axis, and then we're going to rotate in some direction. Again, positive angles rotate counterclockwise, but negative angles rotate clockwise. Now, one thing that can happen as we're looking at our angles plotted out in standard position is we can get what are called coterminal angles. And what coterminal angles are is it's two different angles or multiple different angles that start in the same place, end in the same place, but they are different sized angles. So for example, if I were to draw an angle in standard position, so the initial side starting along that positive x-axis, and then let's say we rotate this angle over here into our second quadrant. Now, because that's rotating clockwise, that's a positive angle. But if I were to take my ray and rotate it in the opposite direction and go in the negative direction and then land at that exact same spot, those angles are starting in the same place, they're ending in the same place, but one of these angles is positive and one of them is negative, so they're going to have different measures. Now, there is a way for us to get coterminal angles by still going in the positive direction. So if I take my angle in standard position and I'm rotating around in the positive direction, but instead of stopping at the side right away, what I'm going to do is make one extra full rotation all the way around and then stop at that side. So again, we started in the exact same place. We even rotated in the positive direction, but we went one extra rotation all the way around before I stopped at that terminal side. So these are still coterminal angles. Now let's say, for example, that this red angle in here was an angle of 135 degrees. If I wanted to find the measure of this blue coterminal angle, because I went backwards, what I can do is I can take this 135 degree angle since I know its measure, and if we think about the measure of a full circle in degrees, we know that's 360 degrees. But we're kind of working backwards on this one, so what I would do is I would subtract off 360 degrees. So that would give me an angle of negative 225 degrees. So this blue angle right here is negative 225 degrees. Now, if I wanted to look at the measure of that purple angle, so I know from this starting initial side over to this other terminal side, if we just measure that directly, we said that that was going to be 135 degrees. But for this purple angle, I made one extra full rotation around. So what I would do there is I would take my 135 degree measure, and because I went an extra full rotation, again, we know that a full rotation in degrees means 360 degrees. So I would add on an additional 360 degrees to that 135 degrees that we've already got in there. So we would get 495 degrees as the measure of that purple angle. And really, I can make any number of rotations that I want. For this purple angle, we went around just one extra time, but I could go around two extra times, so then I would need to add 360 again. or I could go around 3 extra times, so then I would need to add 360 again. Same thing could happen in the negative direction as well. I could make an extra negative rotation, so then I would just have to subtract off 360. Now we can also deal with coterminal angles in terms of radians. So if I draw my initial side here, and I'm going to draw that exact same terminal side, and we called that 135 degrees before, but if I were to take that and convert that over into radians, I would get 3 pi over 4. Now in terms of radians, one full rotation is 2 pi. So if I wanted to go in the negative direction, then what I would do is I would take that 3 pi over 4 and I would subtract off 2 pi. Now in order to do this, we would need to get common denominators, and right now that 2 pi is technically over 1, so I would multiply top and bottom by 4 in order to get those common denominators in there. So this would be 8 pi over 4. So if I take 3 pi over 4 and I subtract 8 pi over 4, then that would give me the negative coterminal angle, negative 5 pi over 4. Now similarly, if I wanted to make one extra rotation all the way around and then stop at this side, instead of subtracting off a 2 pi, I would add a 2 pi. So I would take that 3 pi over 4 and I would add 2 pi to that. But again, we're going to have to get common denominators. And like we just saw before, 2 pi is the same as 8 pi over 4. So I'd really be adding 8 pi over 4. So if I take 3 pi over 4 plus 8 pi over 4, I get 11 pi over 4. And again, if I'm making extra rotations in here, then I would just need to add on 2 pi for every extra rotation that we make. Or if we're going in the negative direction, then we would just need to subtract off 2 pi for those extra rotations. So in this first example, we're going to look at finding a positive and a negative coterminal angle for the angle 30 degrees. Because we're dealing in degrees, we should be keeping 360 in our mind. To get a positive coterminal angle, what we're going to do is we're going to take that 30 degrees that we know, and a positive coterminal angle means that we're making one extra rotation in the positive direction. So we would add on 360 degrees, because one full rotation in degrees is 360. So we would get 390 degrees. If I wanted to find another positive coterminal angle, I would just add on 360 again, and I'd get 750 degrees. And I could keep doing that as many times as I want for as many positive angles as I want. Now, if I want to deal with a negative coterminal angle, then instead of adding 360, I'm going to subtract 360 degrees. So I would get negative 330 degrees. But then again, if I wanted another negative coterminal angle, I could just subtract off 360 degrees again, and I'd get negative 690 degrees. So you can find any number of positive coterminal angles by adding on extra rotations, adding on extra 360s as many times as you want, and you can find any number of negative coterminal angles by subtracting 360 as many times as you want. Now let's look at a radian example. So we want to find positive and negative coterminal angles here. When we're talking about full rotations in terms of radians, that means we're dealing with 2 pi. So if I want to find a positive coterminal angle for the angle pi over 6, I need to add on 2 pi. But in order to add these together, we have to get common denominators, and right now that 2 pi is technically over 1, so I would multiply top and bottom by 6. So that turns into 12 pi over 6. So if I take pi over 6 plus 12 pi over 6, I get 13 pi over 6 as my positive coterminal angle. But just like we saw with degrees, we can make extra rotations if we want to. So I could add on another 2 pi, which would be the same thing as 12 pi over 6, just like we saw earlier. So then I'd get 25 pi over 6. So we can keep adding on this 2 pi as many times as we want to get as many positive coterminal angles as we want. Now if I want to go in the negative direction, instead of adding the 2 pi, I'm going to subtract off the 2 pi. And we saw earlier that 2 pi is the same as 12 pi over 6. So if I take pi over 6 minus 12 pi over 6, I get negative 11 pi over 6. And just like we were saying before, I could subtract off more rotations if I wanted to. I can subtract off as many rotations as I want to get as many coterminal angles as I want. That's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching.